Well, Katie Kosh, the world is perhaps more clearly being divided between the developing old economies and the new economies because of the way that Europe and America are slowing and in such trouble with the debt. And I guess the emerging economies are, are still growing.
Yeah.
So how do you see that from your position as a portfolio strategist? Do you basically having to divide your portfolios between the two, or just focus on emerging economies?
Right. So I think I'd start by saying I agree absolutely with the premise of the question, which is that world growth is increasingly shifting to a part of the world that we actually call growth markets. So the first thing I would say is that we no longer call them emerging markets, some of the most big and important ones, because we think they've evolved and emerged already. And because they are having such a dramatically positive impact on global growth, that they need to be thought of in a new paradigm. And the way that we call them now growth markets, we think is a better recognition of the impact those countries can have. And to quantify that for you, we actually think that 8 countries that we call growth markets are going to drive 60% of global growth over the next decade. And in fact, if you were to look at the top 10 contributors to global growth over the next 10 years, we think 8 out of 10 of them are going to be the growth markets.
Which of those 8 markets? Do you want to just run through them?
Sure. It's all of the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And then 4 growth markets after the BRICS are Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey. And those together, again, going to be the engines of global growth. So to get to the point of your question, we absolutely think that these countries need to be a very core part of client portfolios, both in the equity part of their portfolio as well as the fixed income part of their portfolio. There's obviously still a place for developed market exposure. You know clearly very well in this market that there are developed market listed companies that can benefit from the dynamics in these economies. But increasingly, we think that there is a very strong investment case to be invested directly into these countries.
These growth economies, how dependent are they on the developed world?
I would say that going forward, we actually think they're going to be less dependent. And the reason for that is that we think domestic consumption is going to be a much bigger driver of growth within these countries. So maybe we can take China as an example. Over the last 10 years, China is obviously very dependent on developed markets because their growth model was about exporting, particularly in the light manufacturing sector, to the rest of the world. In the next 10 years, China is going to grow slower than it did in the last 10. So maybe that's the bad news, and we saw some of that come out last Friday, where they printed growth at about 7.6%, slightly below consensus and obviously below the trend growth of the last decade. But there is good news in that, which is that the next 10 years is going to be, in our view, a period of higher quality growth because it's going to be internally generated growth. And increasingly, they're going to be dependent on their own citizens and domestic consumption for driving growth going forward. And if I could broaden that out to the other countries that we talked about, the growth markets, a pretty remarkable fact about those countries is that we think 2 billion people are going to enter the middle class across the growth market countries in the next 2 decades. And so that just gives you a sense that there's going to be increasingly a domestic driver of growth within those countries. The last point I just want to make there is that in our actively managed portfolios, we obviously recognize that growth is slowing in Europe as well as in the US. And so we overweight this theme of domestic consumption, and hopefully that gives our portfolios some insulation from the woes in developed markets.